Employer of Last Resort-led Economic Development, A Plan for Tunisia by Fadhel Kaboub. The Employer of Last Resort Explained. The history of economic thought is full of employer of last resort ideas and policy proposals, going all the way back to William Petty. However, the contemporary employer of last resort literature has been primarily developed within the post-Keynesian framework by Hyman Minsky, L. Randall Wray, William Mitchell, Edward Nell, and Matthew Forstater, to mention a few. Minsky's contribution to the revival of the employer of last resort literature came in the 1960s, in the context of the war against poverty in the United States. The basic approach is straightforward. Accept the poor as they are and tailor-make jobs to fit their capabilities. After this is done, programs to improve the capabilities of low-income workers are in order. Minsky, 1966. In other words, Minsky's model of jobs first, train later was the basic philosophy behind his full employment proposal. He rejected the neoclassical assumption of labor homogeneity and labor fluidity, and aimed at designing a policy that recognizes labor heterogeneity, skilled versus unskilled, and makes do with the available labor force. Quote, the emphasis upon job training, labor relocation, and other similar programs is intended to make labor more homogeneous. However, there are limits to the capacity of such programs to transform particular types of labor, which are in excess supply, into types that are in excess demand. End quote. Minsky, 1965. Along the same lines, Minsky also suggests that we might have to figure out ways to divide complex jobs into simpler jobs that the available labor surplus is capable of doing. Quote, work should be made available to all who want work at the national minimum wage. This would be a wage support law, analogous to the price supports for agricultural products. It would replace the minimum wage law, for if work is available to all at the minimum wage, no labor will be available to private employers at a wage lower than this minimum. That is, the problem of coverage of occupations would disappear. To qualify for employment at these terms, all that would be necessary would be to register at the local public employment office. End quote. Minsky, 1965. According to Minsky, the employer of last resort can achieve the above stated goals by creating, quote, an infinitely elastic demand for labor at a floor or minimum wage that does not depend upon long and short-run profit expectations of business. Since only government can divorce the offering of employment from the profitability of hiring workers, the infinitely elastic demand for labor must be created by government. End quote. Minsky, 1986. In the CFEPS and coffee versions of employer of last resort, the government guarantees a real job opportunity for anyone ready, willing, and able to work at a fixed, socially established basic wage, plus benefits, thus exogenously setting the price of labor. Footnote 1. CFEPS is the Center for Full Employment and Price Stability. Coffee is the Center for Full Employment and Equity. With the employer of last resort, the government will provide a price anchor and establish greater price stability. During a recession, the size of the employer of last resort pool increases to absorb workers displaced from the private sector, and when the economy booms, it automatically shrinks when employer of last resort workers find employment in the private sector. Hence, it operates as a buffer stock employment program. The employer of last resort wage is fixed, while the quantity of labor in the buffer stock fluctuates. Private sector employers can obtain labor at a markup over the employer of last resort fixed wage. Hence, the price stabilization feature of the program. Furthermore, employer of last resort reduces the depreciation of skills caused by unemployment and it contains a training component to prepare participants for private sector employment. The employer of last resort also gives more opportunities and freedom of choice for both workers and employers. Participation in the program is voluntary, so nobody will be forced to participate in employer of last resort jobs. In addition, the employer of last resort does not displace private sector jobs since it offers jobs which are undersupplied or not supplied at all by the private sector. The employer of last resort jobs are socially useful, so it is not a make-work program. Such jobs include companions to the elderly, public school classroom assistants, safety monitors, low-income housing restoration engineers, environmental safety monitors, daycare assistants for employer of last resort workers, community and cultural historians, and employer of last resort artists or musicians. Ray, 1998. Building on Abba Lerner's functional finance theory, the employer of last resort advocates argue that the government always has the financial capacity to pay for the program. Unemployment only develops because government spending is insufficient relative to private savings. Mitchell, 2001. The size of the deficit necessary to maintain full employment is irrelevant. So is the national debt, for the simple reason that the logic of government finances is totally different from that of households or firms. The employer of last resort proponents show that tax payments do not and cannot finance government spending, for at the aggregate level, only the government can be the net supplier of fiat money. As a result, the starting point is government expenditure. Once government spends, creates or supplies fiat money to purchase goods and services, it provides the private sector with the necessary amount of money to meet tax liabilities, save, and maintain transaction balances. The government can safely run a deficit up to the point where it has provided the quantity of non-interest earning fiat money and interest earning bonds desired by the public. Ray, 1998, and Mitchell, 2001. Employer of last resort critics often claim that the program would increase labor bargaining power since it eliminates the threat of unemployment, thus putting more pressure on the wage inflation spiral. In response, employer of last resort supporters argue that a skilled pool of employable employer of last resort workers presents a greater threat to private sector employees than the traditional reserve army of the unemployed. Thus, one should not expect runaway inflation to develop under the employer of last resort program, Ray, 1998. Furthermore, the additional amount of government spending can hardly be inflationary given the low cost of running the program. Estimates for the United States, United Kingdom, and Australia have shown that the cost of financing employer of last resort ranges between less than 1% of GDP for the United States to about 3.5% of GDP in Australia. Mitchell and Watts, 1997, Gordon, 1997, Kitson, Michie, and Sutherland, 1997, Majewski, 2004, Fulweiler, 2003, and 2005. However, these estimates overstate the real cost of financing the program because they ignore the multiplier effects generated by the new income earned by employer of last resort workers. Employer of last resort proponents also argue that the program will pay for itself through the reduction in other social spending associated with unemployment, unemployment benefits, food stamps, crime, police and courts, etc. This paper will establish that such claims are also true for a small developing country like Tunisia, and that developing countries not only can afford a fully employed economy, but also can grow at a faster rate than under the current development schemes.